The idea of discipleship is woven throughout the scriptures. Both the Hebrews and the Greeks had a similar but yet distinctive way of approaching it. Let's look at either side of that. First of all, as far as ancient Hebrew discipleship went, in the first century, discipleship among the Hebrews was a process that a person went through to become a rabbi. The rabbis in those days would select young men whom they believed could become rabbis in the future. It was common that at the age of 12 or 13, a young man would be selected to become a disciple and would then travel around several years with their rabbi. Rabbis would frequently publicly teach and preach with a group of young men following them. The idea was that these young men were apprentices or rabbis in training. During their discipleship, these young Hebrew boys were being trained in the way of the rabbi. They would be trained in his theology, how he taught, his philosophy, and how he believed the Jews should function during the time. The rabbi's hope, of course, was that when he died, the young man, or men rather, they had trained would then take on their mantle and their way of doing things would then continue. That's, in a nutshell, the essence of the root and concept of Hebrew discipleship. The ancient Greeks also had a system for discipleship, but they used different terminology, but it was very similar, and it actually predates the Jewish rabbinical system in some ways, going back to the times of Aristotle and Plato in ancient Greece. The ancient Greek philosophers would similarly select young men and would train them to learn their philosophy and way of doing things. They would teach them to write and read material that was in line with that philosopher's way of thinking. If you were being trained or mentored by a particular Greek philosopher, you were expected to learn as much as you could to help give additional evidence to that philosopher's way of thinking or way of teaching. Everything you did was aimed at spreading the ideas of the person you were training under. The goal was not to be your own person, but to understand your teacher's thought and seek to expand his ideology and philosophy. So, again, as I go over those, you see a lot of similarities in the sense that they were being trained to follow the lead and style of their master or teacher, but yet there were some differences. Greek discipleship was focused in a more academic fashion, although there was a facet of that among the Hebrew disciples. Some may call it more heady, meaning that that it tended to be more focused upon learning history and philosophy. Jewish discipleship or Hebrew discipleship, on the other hand, certainly shared some of these Greek components, but it was more centered on learning how to live like your rabbi. How did he function with his family? How did he treat the poor? How did he worship, etc.? So Greek discipleship was in a way less personal and more knowledge-based with an emphasis on academics, history, and philosophy. Jewish or Hebrew discipleship sought to marry the academic components of discipleship and mentorship to the personal heart issues related to mentorship and training. So those are a bit of the distinctives there. Obviously, if we're talking about the life of Jesus, and he had his followers or disciples that called him rabbi, so Jesus would have been steeped in the Hebrew sense of discipleship. But I would affirm this morning that those who claim to be children of God are also called to be disciples of Jesus. Yes, Jesus had his own hand-picked disciples and called others to be disciples. And of course, he trained his disciples or followers to make other disciples. He gave them that charge in Matthew chapter 6 or 18, Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. Go and make disciples. So we, I believe, are called to be disciples of Jesus if we claim to be children of God. But what does that involve? I see there are at least four essential qualities that are to be found in every disciple of Christ. There could be more, and likely there are, but I see these four as very, very essential. I want to take some time during this lesson to look at each one of them in turn. Essential quality number one is a heart that's submissive. Every disciple of Christ is called to have a heart of submission. See, being a disciple of Jesus involves realizing our place in relation to the Lord. Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. He said, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign the members of his household?" And of course, the key point there is Jesus is saying there's a place for a disciple, and it's not above his teacher. A disciple is there to learn from, to place himself under the leadership and tutorship of his teacher. So being a disciple involves realizing our place in relation to Jesus. A disciple, as we understand it in the Bible, can allow no rivals to the teacher. If you sign up, if you will, to be under this particular rabbi or teacher, then you can't spend a facet of your time following someone else. Jesus said it this way in Luke chapter 14 and verse 33. He said, "So then none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions." Now that's just one facet of life, but there Jesus is emphasizing possessions cannot become a rival to the master. Any other area of life is called to be in submission to the one you're following. We do note, of course, in the scriptures that Jesus isn't teaching a principle here that he was unwilling to practice himself. Jesus wasn't one to preach one thing and practice another. We see evidence of it in his own ministry in places like Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39. As Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane just prior to his arrest and ultimate crucifixion, Jesus is praying fervently to the Father, and he says in Matthew 26:39, it says he went beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me," this cup of suffering, this cup of pain and anguish that he was about to go through. But he says, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." That's a great model for a disciple. Jesus is modeling the discipleship he's calling on for his followers, a willingness to submit to the Father's will in everything, and even to the sense of the anguish that he was going to endure. In John chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus says, "And he who sent me is with me, and he has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him." What a great example. Jesus always submitted his will to the one he called Father. And as a disciple, we're called to submit our will, our hearts, to our Master. You see, a submissive attitude is really a key to any part of learning in any situation. A couple of examples we could point to. If you're training a wild animal, maybe a horse, you see, every animal you set out to train is kind of like a disciple. But a wild animal has to learn submission to the trainer before learning can really take place, right? The trainer has to teach that wild animals to submit to his will before any other type of learning can take place. Another area of life that we could illustrate with would be military recruits. Military recruits have to learn to bend their wills to the will of their superior officers, even if they disagree. And that has to happen before they're put into battle situations, because a military unit has to learn to work as a team and to take orders, and there can't be any questioning of those things in the heat of the battle. So in every area of life, we understand this principle. A submissive attitude is a key part of learning. Our wills, as disciples of Jesus, must be submitted to him before we can truly learn from him and become like him. The question that begs answering at this point in principle number one, a heart that is submissive, I need to answer the question, am I willing as a disciple of Jesus to submit to the guidance of the master teacher? Principle number two, our ears that are attentive. Not only must our hearts be submissive, but we need to have ears that are attentive, ears that listen to the teacher. If you know your New Testament well, you know that one phrase in various forms Jesus used often in his ministry was something like, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Matthew 11, verse 15, and Matthew 13, verse 9 are two places where Jesus pauses in the midst of what he's teaching and saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. In essence, saying, listen up. Jesus taught that we need to have attentive ears. You see, a disciple should do more listening than arguing, more listening than contradicting, more listening than challenging their teacher. Now, if a teacher invites you to interject with something, then that's fine. But we're called as disciples to be more listeners than speakers. If we're not careful, we can assume the attitude that Peter did at one time in the ministry of the Lord. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 22, Jesus is teaching his disciples about his upcoming, appointment with the cross, the struggle that he was going to go through, even to the point of death. And Peter, it says in Matthew 16:22, took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Now, again, Peter loved his Lord, so we're not castigating or casting any shadows on him for, blurting this out because he cared for Jesus. But on the other hand, Jesus goes on and tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. And it was rebuke there that Peter needed to hear, because Peter here was not listening very well. He was arguing with the teacher for no reason to do that other than, again, his own feelings. So again, we're counseling here that a disciple of Jesus needs to listen, even if it's difficult to hear. Of course, while our ears are always open to the words of Jesus as his disciple, we also need to be discerning about other sources of audio input. We need to ask the question, because we live in a world, especially today, where there's all kinds of voices vying for our attention. We need to ask something like, do these words line up with the words of Jesus? If we claim to be a disciple of Jesus, it's his words that are most important. It's his words that we need to listen to. And as these other voices compete, we need to compare them to the words of Jesus. But we need to be discerning. Jesus himself said in Mark chapter 4 and verse 24, take care what you listen to. By your standard of measure will be measured to you, and more will be given to you besides. So again, we're focusing there on the idea Jesus says, take care what you listen to. Not everything you hear is right or true. That's why you compare it to the words of the master. So let's think about answering another question. Am I listening to the master teacher? Is my heart not only submissive to him, but are my ears open to everything he says, even if it may be difficult to hear? Am I willing to hear what the teacher is saying? Principle number 3, we talked about having a heart that's submissive, ears that are open. Thirdly, we need to have minds that are open. See, Jesus often did or said things that challenged the preconceived ideas of his disciples. The gospel records, it happened over and over again. Jesus would say something that would rock their world or challenge the way they understood things, of how they had been taught. And Jesus didn't shy back from doing that. And sometimes it cost him disciples or followers. I'm thinking of the instance in John chapter 6. I'll be reading verses 59 through 67. John 6, 59 through 67. Listen to these words. Jesus here in John 6 is saying some difficult things. He says, these things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Therefore, verse 60, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it? So his discipleships were coming to a crossroads here. Jesus is challenging what they thought they knew or what they thought they understood. Verse 61 says, but Jesus, conscious that his disciples grumbled at this, said to them, does this cause you to stumble? What then if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. But there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who it was that would betray him. He was saying, verse 65, for this reason I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted him from the Father. And note this, As a result of this, in context there, it's the words that Jesus spoke, the teaching that he'd just given. As a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. So Jesus said to the 12, "You do not want to go away also, do you?" I use that as an illustration from Jesus's life that, again, Jesus often challenged what his disciples thought, and sometimes it cost him followers. But Jesus didn't back off from what he said. You see, closed-mindedness, in some sense, is an unhealable malady. No, you can overcome closed-mindedness, but it only comes by opening your mind. And if we remain closed-minded, then it's really an unfixable problem. Closed-mindedness can insulate us from the very thing needed to help us, the words and actions of the teacher, Jesus. Again, I need to ask myself the question, am I willing as a disciple of Jesus to listen to a new way of looking at something? Fair question to ask, because sometimes we're more closed-minded than we think. Am I willing to listen to a new way of thinking? We're not saying here that we're not talking about adopting something necessarily. Am I just willing to consider it? If not, then how can I be viewed as a learner? Can I think beyond the boundaries of what I've always been taught? And if we're going to be disciples of Jesus, we're going to be challenged in those ways. So we need to be willing to have an open mind, especially to the words and actions of Jesus. And I would remind us also that there is a difference between open-mindedness and gullibility. As someone has said that, we don't need to be so open-minded that our brains fall out. Jesus made a distinction. The apostles made distinctions. There is a difference between open-mindedness and gullibility. There's a difference between being willing to think and being willing to accept anything that comes along. Those are not the same things. Paul said it this way in Ephesians 4:14. He says, "There, as a result, we are no longer to be children tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming." It's children who are more gullible than adults because they just haven't learned how to discern some things. And Paul says spiritually, we shouldn't be willing to just accept anything that comes our way, any doctrine that blows by. So we're not being so open-minded that we just accept anything. He said in Colossians 2, verse 8, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ." So again, we're counseling that a disciple must be open-minded, but not so open-minded that we just accept anything. We can accept everything and anything Jesus teaches without distinction, but that doesn't hold true for everything else. The main question here is, am I willing as a disciple of Jesus to be taught by the master teacher? Am I willing to open my mind to truths that may challenge what I've always believed? Am I willing to change on the basis of that? Finally, principle number 4. Again, we're talking about hearts that are submissive, ears that are open, or ears that are attentive, minds that are open. Fourthly, an essential quality of the disciple is an appetite that is unquenchable. An appetite that's unquenchable. Disciples need to have, if you will, an insatiable hunger and thirst for the words and ways of their teacher. I'm reminded of Jesus as he did battle with Satan in the wilderness after his baptism. Matthew 4, verse 4, following one of those temptations, Satan tempts Jesus to turn the stones into bread, and Jesus answered this way, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." That's this spiritual hunger Jesus is teaching about. In Matthew 5, the next chapter in verse 6, as part of the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." That hunger and thirst, that insatiable, unquenchable appetite for the things of God, that's a disciple's trait. In John, of course, verse 48, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Then in John 7:34, he says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Jesus is the bread of life. He's the living water we all need as disciples. And it's our focus is to be spiritually on him for the satisfaction of the spiritual hunger and thirst. The Apostle Peter later in the New Testament described what Jesus is talking about here as the longing of a newborn for milk. If you've been a parent, you know that when it comes time for a baby, when a baby is hungry, he or she lets you know it, right? A baby will be thinking about nothing else. They'll be crying for their milk. Can't focus on anything else. Well, that's how Peter describes it in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 2. He says, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. Once again, we note from the life of Jesus that he exemplified this trait as he did the will of his Father. In John chapter 4 and verse 34, Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. And that's what we're encouraging here as disciples of Christ. Our lives ought to reflect this same attitude, that our food, our spiritual drink as a disciple of Christ is to do the will of our teacher, the will of Jesus, to accomplish what he's called us to do. Once again, let's pause long enough to ask ourselves the question, as a disciple, am I willing to make the words and work of my teacher, Jesus Christ, my greatest priority? Now, are there other God-given priorities in life? Of course there are. There's good, God-given priorities, things like marriages and families and jobs, and on the list goes. There are, again, godly priorities. But every other priority, even those God calls us to, are guided by this ultimate priority. And that's what we're categorizing here as a hunger and thirst for what Jesus wants in those areas. What does Jesus want for my marriage? What does Jesus want for my family? How does Jesus want me to carry myself in my job or my recreation, or on and on the list goes? And that's the overarching umbrella of priority over all these other ones. Jesus said it in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 37. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Again, we're called by Jesus as well as God to love our fathers and mothers and to love our sons and daughters. That's a God-given thing, but we can't love anything, them or anything else, more than we love our teacher. That's the mold of a disciple. See, as we think about all of this, we realize that being a disciple of Jesus is certainly not the path of least resistance, is it? In fact, I would affirm that if you're looking for easy street, being a disciple of Jesus isn't it. If you can't be bothered to have your life disrupted or rearranged, then discipleship with Christ is not for you. I don't say that to discourage anyone, but we need to understand the reality. This is a deep call to some important things. And are we willing to make the sacrifice? As we've noted today, there are four basic qualities that I believe are vital to being a disciple of Jesus. Number one, a submissive heart. Number two, ears that are attentive to his words. Number three, an open mind that is willing to consider something different than perhaps we've always considered. And then finally, as we've just discussed, an unquenchable appetite for the things and words of God. For those who are willing to make the commitment, it can change your life for the better in many, many ways. No, it won't take away every struggle in life. In fact, it may compound some struggles. That's part of the package. But I do believe that being a disciple of Jesus will equip you to deal with those struggles in some much better and much more healthy ways than the world counsels. Again, the final question for you to think about, are you willing to be a disciple of Christ? It's a high calling. It's a difficult calling, but it's one that can change our here and now as well as our future. Are you willing to be a disciple of Christ? It's by grace through faith that you can answer that call. Praise God for his willingness for all men and women to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. God wants you to be a disciple of Christ. Are you willing to make the necessary commitment? God bless. Have a great week.